What's up, everybody? I'm the Bat Otter, and by popular demand, and by that I mean by the demand of one person with a Club Penguin avatar, I'm gonna do a review on this biography, kind of, sort of. I just wanted an excuse to talk about Leonardo da Vinci because, you read a book this long, you tend to get some things on it, and I make videos occasionally whenever I feel like it. And so you kind of do it. Plus, I have his notebooks. I want to get more of his notebooks. I've looked into so many things that on Instagram, it's showing me like, oh, you could buy this $200 book that's probably the size of both of these combined, and it's a compendium of all of his notes and sketches. And I'm just like, I wish I had money. Like, I wish I had that money that you can just spend. Somebody's like, oh, that's $200. Oh, I could spend $200, and then they can eat the next day. But no, it's fine. This is passable. So you'll probably see a lot of cuts in this video because it's a really big book, and I'm not just gonna read it to y'all. So yeah, let's get started. I totally don't know where to go with this, but yeah, let's just get some basics out of the way. He was born in Vinci. That's what that means. And he originally started in Florence. So first cut out of the way. So a lot of people obviously know Leonardo da Vinci as a painter, and the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the Annunciation. No, is that one? I think it's one. But believe it or not, he only painted, I think the number was 2 or 4 paintings from the age of 20 to the age of 30, because quite frankly, he wasn't very disciplined, if you would believe that. He was very obsessed, but not disciplined. You kind of know the difference. Discipline is you start something and you finish it. Obsessed is you're just obsessed with something until you're not. And so after he left his hometown to Florence, which is where he made his stay in his younger years, he was exploring a lot of the different things. He worked with a guy named Verrocchio in a studio, and that's kind of where he was able to refine his art. He did the Baptism of Christ alongside Verrocchio, as in the Renaissance, as they said in the book, there were a lot of collaborative efforts. The paintings weren't all you sit down and you paint it. It was actually a studio painting. Imagine it like an art shop. You go to the shop, you see a painting that you like, you buy it, and then they just replace it. It's like that, but instead of a printing press or reprinting another print, they had to repaint it. So in his paintings that he did with Verrocchio said, just retired. He was, I'm done. He painted the water at Christ's feet, one of the angels, and some of the background in the initial painting. Let's see if I could pull it up somewhere in here. And that kind of led Verrocchio to say, like, hey, man, you've kind of outgrown me. Obviously, I'm passing some of his unfinished work. Here it is. So this is kind of his claim to fame. You see the ripples in the water, and this was in his early 20s whenever he did this painting, and you see the curls that are reminiscent of Da Vinci. And very early on, he was, Leonardo that is, was criticizing other artists for work and lighting and anatomy like this, as you can see here, describing it as being cut like wood. They illustrate their figures as though they're wooden carvings rather than human form, because of how dramatic the lighting is. There's no blend, there's no merge, and so whenever you look here, it looks real, and you think, oh, that's just water, but you never notice the good things, you only ever notice the bad. So he spent a good deal of time in Florence working on paintings that would really never be complete because of the fact that he just never got to them. Here's St. Jerome. He carried this around a very long time, making edits on the cervical muscles, I think in his 40s and 50s. Mind you, he started this in his 20s. And then, of course, the Adoration of the Magi. See, this is a spectacular piece. He was very interested in curved compositions, which I myself, and now a light just went out, a fan of doing and implementing into my own work. But here, he was too much of a perfectionist. He started the piece, he integrated all of these figures into it, but the interplay of the lighting pretty much would have driven him crazy. And considering I work in black and white, and I've been driven crazy by a piece of artwork before, I can kind of see where he's coming from. So this would have been one of his greatest pieces, but unfortunately it was never finished. So due to his unreliability in Florence, they were like, oh, let's get him out of here. But fortunately, he fancied himself as more than just an artist. That's why he was a Renaissance man, because he knew all these different things. He ended up going to what would become one of his favorite places to be, and that is Milan. And reading about his journey to Milan and the letters that he was sending, I believe it was the Sforzas, who were ruling Milan at the time, he was like, oh man, the things I can do, because he's a military ruler, right? That's what military rulers like to hear, is what you can do with a gun. And so I've never obviously reviewed a book before. I've actually had one of the JoJo videos taken down, so I'm trying not to get copyright. But he starts sending the military ruler of Milan blueprints and sketches of different weapons and engineering feats that he could do. Here's a chariot that is powered by a horse, obviously, but it causes gears to rotate, spinning these little scythes to cut people down. He had a very morbid curiosity, and here's the infamous giant crossbow that he made that unfortunately couldn't account for probably the square cube law that people tried to recreate in this past century. Didn't work, but he was telling this guy, oh yeah, I could do all this stuff. I could make these giant crossbows. He even went as far as to redesign cities and Milan to make more perfect cities, and believe it or not, a lot of his redesigns, while they were never implemented into Milan itself, a lot of his more fantastical ideas were never truly executed in his lifetime or even thereafter. They are practical engineering and practical things to do in whatever context they were doing. He wanted to redesign stairways, which you think, why would you want to do that? Well, because believe it or not, people like to pee and defecate and do nasty things in stairways. So he proposed an idea to redesign stairways to be spiral staircases. Obviously, he had a fascination with spirals, so of course he would lean towards that. But he said something very peculiar about it, and you could find the quote in the book. He said, corners give men a place to pee. That's not an exact quote. But if there are no corners, where are you going to pee? And man, I've been to a high school recently, and you know, I'm still young enough to remember high school. I'm like, he couldn't be more correct about corners and just nasty things going on in the corners of stairwells. So replacing all of the stairways with spirals, I think that would be a pretty practical idea. So consider that for his practical engineering. And fortunately, he didn't have to engineer most of the things that he was selling to Sforza on his way to Milan, because, truth be told, most of them probably wouldn't have worked. They work in principle, just not as much in practice, and being that he never truly designed any of them or actually worked on any of them, they may not have worked as well as he would have liked. But he did design other things for invasions, because Italy was not a unified state or country at the time. You had the Vatican ruling over Rome. You had Sforza ruling over Milan. Florence was oftentimes passed around between French, the people of Milan, the Venetians, I believe, as well. There was a lot of infighting at the time in the 1500s in Italy. So there was a lot of emphasis on military engineering. Later in the book, he works with Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Rodrigo Borgia. And it was at that point in his life, I believe he was already in his 50s or 40s by the time he worked with Cesare, that his fascination with military engineering and the war in general was kind of dispelled, because seeing the brutality of Cesare, uh, it kind of opened his eyes to how brutal war actually was. And while he still had that morbid curiosity within him, seeing it was like, okay, I think I've gotten my fair share. I know all I need to know. And while he never really stopped making weapons or designing weapons in his books, he did stop having so much of an emphasis. He's like, I'm done with this. Which is pretty fair. If you hear some of the stuff that Cesare would do to people, it was pretty messed up. But there is something, a saving grace out of his experience with Cesare, and it's one of my favorite of his incomplete pieces. Actually, most of his incomplete pieces are my favorite, just for different reasons. This here is a recreation of the Battle of Angari, don't know how to pronounce that, which is a battle scene that him and Michelangelo were commissioned to paint for the halls of a Florence court center, something or another. And then he was supposed to do it on a wall. Now, believe it or not, painting on a wall and painting on canvas, or painting on what Da Vinci would typically paint on, which was wood planks, I believe, pecan, walnut, all those kinds of woods. He would paint on those surfaces, which is where you get the Mona Lisa, which is where you get some of his portraits and his most well-known paintings. So unlike Michelangelo, he was very inexperienced on making frescoes and painting on walls, which contributed to the deterioration of the only fresco that is maintained by him to this day, which is the Last Supper. But believe it or not, even that painting was deteriorating in the time that it was there. So this here is obviously a recreation, but this is pretty much as far as Da Vinci had gotten in his painting. The Florence court had commissioned him and Michelangelo as kind of a, these are the best two painters in Italy, let's have them hash it out because they're painting right across from each other. And as much as Leonardo was one to, let's not say insult, but have a little bit of a competitive edge with people in writing, he wasn't much of a competitor himself. He liked to do what he wanted to do when he wanted to do it, not so much, oh, I know what they're doing, they want us to compete. He wanted to play his own game. And then of course it was on a wall, so he never finished it. But when you look at this painting here, the recreation itself, and you look at the motion in the hair, this is every painting that he does is such a culmination of his studies into science and art together, and mathematics even, that you don't even truly realize how much goes into each of these paintings, which is why I'm so fond of him as an artist, because reading through this book, there got to a point where chapter after chapter, the author Walter Isaacson would go over again. He discovered this X amount of centuries before it was then rediscovered by another influential scientist. It got to the point where I was reading that so many times it got boring. Like the first 3 times I was like, wow, that's really interesting. But then it kept on going and going and going. And it's like, dude, how many things did Leonardo da Vinci discover centuries before they were... He beat Newton to the laws of motion, by the way. He had them all written down, almost verbatim. But he never published any of his work, so it was never put out to the public. The public just remained in the current paradigm that they're at until revolutionaries like Isaac Newton, Bernoulli, and other such people came out with those treatises. But regardless, I'm talking about this painting here. His studies into human anatomy are what allowed him to bend the bodies in such a way and contort them in almost uncomfortable manner to depict the uncomfortableness of war. I don't know if any of y'all have ever been to war, but I've heard it's not very much fun. So, of course, you want a lot of motion in the image. You want a lot of emotion as well to be evoked by the faces of the participants. Even the horses. He dissected, I believe it was 14 or 15 horses whenever he was working on this giant horse, the equestrian statue that he was going to do for one of the rulers of one of the Italian states at the time. So he knew a thing or two about horses, but you look at the interplay. This horse is screaming here. This man is grimacing. They're all swinging the swords. There's the flow with the hair, and believe it or not, the hair and the motion there comes a lot from his studies into fluid dynamics and I believe hydraulics as well, because he noticed the similarities and he would always draw comparisons and metaphors between different things and different properties of the world. So he noticed that hair would often have a similar flow to that of water and even air. It was his understanding of fluid dynamics, that being aerodynamics, that he was able to hypothesize so many flying machines. And in my opinion, the way that he was engineering these flying machines, the helicopters, the winged machines, were pulley propulsion, right? Bear with me. Like a bicycle, right? You pedal a bicycle, it moves. So just think of that, but with a helicopter. Think of that with a winged plane. Pretty much, he had all of the proper principles, even in the understanding of the pulley and the mechanics that go in to the mechanisms of a flying machine, but he didn't have the method. It could only be powered by a human. It could only be powered by an animal. So while his understanding of air, his understanding of aerodynamics was all there, in my opinion, from what I read, it was the technology of his time that ultimately held him back. Because to me, if he was given the steam engine, if he was given any of that technology that was just a few centuries away, he would have, without a doubt, created extremely complex mechanisms. And he was so far ahead of his time that he was held back by the time. It was one of those very rare cases, because when you really think about the mechanics of pedaling, the mechanics of the pulley systems that cause the things and the gears and the levers to turn, it's really just a piston. The only difference is it's a piston powered by your leg. It's very, very interesting to me that he was able to observe and study all these things so many centuries before they really happened, all because he asked like really simple questions, right? So yeah, that's why this is one of my favorite pieces of his, because in all of his pieces, there's so much life, there's so much action that's derived from so many other things that you would never even think twice about it. And I know this video is getting very long, and half of it is about one piece, but let me get to another painting real quick. So here's the other painting. If you've ever noticed and you've ever looked at some of these paintings from the Renaissance, from Leonardo da Vinci, you'll notice, at least I noticed ever since I was a kid, I was like, there's something very creepy about them inherently, and I couldn't really figure out what, but they always seem so ghostly. This one in particular is exceptionally so, so I'm showing it as a bit of an exaggeration, this being St. John the Baptist, but I think it's a perfect representation of a recurring feeling that his paintings evoke whenever you look at them, and you don't think twice about it. You see it and you're like, oh, it's ghostly, that's just the way that it looks. This book explains why they're so ghostly, and learning about the techniques and the methods behind the madness, something that is seemingly inconsiderable, like, oh, it's just something that's there, has so much behind it, which is, again, why I love the Renaissance artists so much, because something as simple as a ghostly hue to a painting has so much depth. And as an artist personally, whenever I put everything into one of my drawings, one of my illustrations, I approach it from the same direction. Everything that I learn so many different things. I could read an entire book and then add one thing about this big to a drawing, all for that one little thing, and it's perfect. And it's that little, but there's so much behind it, like the icebergs, right? So the reason that these paintings are so ghostly is because of a technique that I believe he invented, you can check me on that, called sfumato, which is spelled Sfumato, meaning smoky, hazy, and it came from his understanding of light and the interplay of light, because he understood that there are no true edges. If you look at my fingers right now, there's an edge because there's a pixel, but if you keep on looking and you were to look closer and closer with your eyes, there would be no edge to my hand. There would just be around. So the only difference, and this is all from his notes, between two objects, the only things that differentiate the objects in perspective is lighting. If you understand lighting, you can understand depth, perspective, and anything that you need to know in order to create dynamic figures and create interesting artwork. So whenever he made his paintings, he made an effort, a conscious effort, to make sure that there were no straight lines clearly separating any bodies, any entities in the frame. And if you look at this here, sure, of course it's a picture on a book, but can you honestly say that you could see where St. John's shoulder goes to the background? No, you just see the black background. And again, I say that this is a perfect display of that because whenever you look at the shoulder and the back go down, you can't really tell where it ends and it begins, yet you can see it nonetheless. And you can see the background, you know where it is, but can you really point, like, it's right there. It's like, when does a grain of sand become a pile of sand, right? And those are always my favorite paintings. You can even see the draperies that he's holding. I know it's a bit of an androgynous character, but it's St. John, so he... Then, of course, even going up into the hands, the eyes, the shadows cast by the curly hair, all of that is so unreal while stylistically taking realistic and scientific approaches to it and combining it with something that's unreal. So let's get to the Mona Lisa. So here's the Mona Lisa, and you might think, where's all the sfumato? Well, it's in the background, and of course on the painting. I mean, even look at their face. You can't see where the chin becomes the neck, just as you can't really see that. Look at an actual person, like a normal person, not some chisel-jawed individual, but you look at an actual person and there's not really a solid point on the jaw. There's not really a solid jawline for most people. Of course, you have the people with the solid jaws, but again, whenever you draw them with a pen, you obviously take some liberties, you stylize it just a little bit to express the idea properly, but for the most part, there is no solid jawline on most people. So being able to illustrate that has everything to do with not only understanding the anatomy, the fat, the musculature, the bones, but it also understands requiring the lighting. Requiring? I totally got my words there. And the way that the curls fade, everything about that. And so I could go on and on about the sfumato here. But the point is, if you understand all of these things, unlike a lot of artists and everything, you can create paintings like this and make them so good to look at, so fun to look at every single time around, and just become an all-around more incredible artist. That's why I believe that artists should be aware of all these scientific properties and principles. And something as simple as the only thing that separates two things is the lighting, you understand that, and man, you can do so much more and implement so much more into your work. So that's why I believe it's very important to study artists like these, because you can learn so much more from just the artists and their practice and their notebooks, as I have here, than you ever really could from most teachers, from anything else like that. So I'm totally gassing out. It's always at the 20-minute mark. I forget, run out of things to say. But just one last example of, so that way you could better understand what I mean by the understanding of lighting creates for more realistic pieces. If you look here and you look at the highlights on this woman's face, you notice that despite that the light is clearly being cast from this direction onto her face, obviously you can see that the shadows are on her cheek, her chin, her jaw, her neck. You do notice that there's this subtle highlight here. And you wonder, well, where does that... You look at it, and it doesn't look out of place, right? It looks normal. But you gotta wonder why. Why does that look believable? Well, that's because that's light. She's a very pale woman, being reflected off of her own skin back onto her, which is a real thing that happens. Pay very close attention to your skin and the lighting, and look very, very closely. I mean, this is very, very close attention to detail. I mean, you really have to sit and stare every now and then at very mundane things that you would usually never think twice about, but you sit there and you let that curiosity get to you, and you'll notice very acute subtleties like that. He explains it very well in this chapter about the painting, But that I wanted to express visually what I had been talking about in terms of lighting. So 25-minute video. I'll probably talk more about him in the future as I want to look more into Raphael. I already have a pretty well-versed understanding of Michelangelo. I studied and referenced him a lot. I might go over his notebooks. I'm not totally sure. But yeah, I just want to talk about that. Obviously, I had a lot to say. Hope you guys liked it. It's probably going to kill my channel since most people come over here from Hamon Beat. But whatever. You Club Penguin Avatar, I'm looking at you. Thanks for letting me make the video. And yeah, if you guys want to see any of my artwork and see me put my money where my mouth is, go follow me on Instagram at @theBatOtter. I put everything there. Other than that, y'all will probably see another video from me very soon. Peace out.